My name is Chris. I'm one of the pastors here on staff, and we are in a series called Summer Playlist. We're going through just various psalms and talking about what they mean, talking about the authors of these psalms. It's not always David. In this case today, it will be David again, but not always David, and just seeing what God will speak to us through various psalms. Today, we're going to look at Psalms 139. So if you could turn to Psalms 139. And before we look at this in particular psalm, we're going to talk a little bit more about its author. If you remember last week, we talked about, or I talked about how much of an enthusiast I am about music and musicians and deep diving into the lives of musicians. Like, I'm not necessarily a fan of Taylor Swift, but as I follow her dating life, I can appreciate her songs better, you know. There's a lot of meaning to the Psalms that we miss if we don't understand the backstory of the authors of them. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about David, the author of Psalms 139. David, as we've talked about in the past, has not always been a perfect person. We can relate to him in his imperfections a lot more than his high highs and great achievements. We can relate to him a lot better when we look at the realness of his life and the circumstances that caused him to pen the songs that he penned and do the things that he did based on the calling of God that was on his life. But David wasn't always perfect. All he had going for him was what the book of Acts says, and that's when they're reflecting back on his life, it says he had a heart after God. He wanted God's desires to be his desires. He wanted God's ways to be his ways. He wanted the presence of God to be part of his life. He was a man after God's own heart, but he wasn't perfect. He had imperfect liturgy. The things that he did when it came to the various temple activities weren't always perfect. A few weeks ago, we talked about him bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the city and not following the true heart of God in that, and we see the mishaps that happened because of that. And he wasn't always perfect in the way he conducted himself as a quasi-pastor of the nation of Israel. We also saw last week he had imperfect morals. He went from beginning a revival in the nation of Israel to a debacle of epic proportions in his morality when he impregnated this woman, then had her husband killed to cover it up. And that is a high and a very low. We can relate to him in his imperfections a lot more than his great achievements. But today I want to talk about his relationships. Often we don't talk about David's relationships in regards to his calling, in regards to what God did in and through his life. David had dramatically imperfect relationships. Let's walk through a few of them. You can read through the life of David another time, but I'm just going to kind of walk through a few different instances of his life. Take the calling of him to be king, for instance. David was called to be king by a man named Samuel. Now, Samuel came to the house of Jesse. Jesse was David's dad. As Samuel came to the house of Jesse, David's family, it wasn't just that some religious guy was coming to dinner. It wasn't like Pastor John's coming to dinner, so let's tidy up a little bit. This would have been like the president of the United States is coming to your house and everything needs to be right. But not only is it to the magnitude of the president coming to your house. It's that this president, you can choose your president so that we don't begin a bipartisan war within here. I will stay neutral right here. Your president of choice coming to your house that you're excited about. And that president having the ability, if he declares a good thing or a bad thing over your family, it determines the trajectory of the next season of your life. That is the importance of Samuel coming to Jesse's house. Samuel comes to Jesse's house and says, I want you to gather all of your sons and I want you to line them up. Jesse grabs 7 of his sons. Remember how important this is to the family. And he leaves David out in the field. All Samuel knows is one of Jesse's sons is going to be king. That's what I came here for. So he starts with Eliab, and he looks at Eliab, the oldest son. And he looks at him and he says, this guy looks like a king. I mean, he's buff. He looks political, or he looks whatever a king needed to look like in that moment. He said, that's the guy. And this is where we get that phrase that it's quoted a lot within church circles, but God doesn't look on the outside. God looks at the heart. That's God talking to Samuel in the moment where he's looking at David's oldest brother and saying he looks like a king, and God's saying he's not my choice. David at this moment, in an incredibly significant season of his family's life, is overlooked. The one God called is the one his father overlooked. The one who God pinpointed is the one who his father forgot. When we want to talk about the relationships around David's life, we have to take into consideration that in the moment that he was being called to, the thing that he was most known for, his own father didn't think of him as significant enough to bring him to the table. Gotta imagine that was a blow to his ego. You have to imagine that as he went back to normal life from that moment, he started to think about that. Samuel believes in me, but my dad forgot me. And then David goes back to his normal life. His part-time gig is as a shepherd for his dad, and then he also is basically like leader of the house band for Saul. Saul's in the temple, and Saul just gets kind of crazy sometimes, and he needs somebody to play some songs for him. So he hires David as just like the Roots to Jimmy Fallon. Like, this is the house band, and when things get a little bit crazy, I need you to just start to play. And so David has these 2 part-time gigs, and he's just living life knowing that he someday is called to be king. And a moment comes when the Philistines and Israel's at war, and David is at his house, and his dad calls him over. And his dad says, I need you to go bring lunch to your 3 oldest brothers who are on the front line. And so David, out of the goodness of his heart and out of respect for his own father, he brings his 3 oldest brothers basically a charcuterie board. When you look at the ingredients, it's bread, cheese, and probably some sausage. Like, it's just, he's just bringing them some snacks. And he gets to the front line, and he sees Israel on one side, he sees the Philistines on the other, and they're at a standstill. And there's this big guy who's barking a lot of really bad insults at the people of God. He begins to investigate. He says, what is this guy doing? He's standing against us having victory. Well, what happens if somebody defeats him? Well, they get put in the king's palace. They get to marry one of his daughters. It's just a cool gig. Like, but nobody's going to do this. Like, we're at a standstill. And as David's investigating, his oldest brother, Eliab, the one that openly was rejected, remember, first and foremost by Samuel, he overhears David investigating what's going to happen, and he begins to go over to David and just lay into him. He just begins to berate him with insults that only an older brother can do to a younger brother. You're conceited. You're self-serving. You just are here to watch the battle. Remember, he's just here to give him some snacks, and now he's getting chewed out. So now his dad's overlooked him. His brothers called into question all of his motives and character. And then out of that, he defeats Goliath, and he gets put into the palace, and things are starting to click. He gets an internship with the guy who he knows he will eventually take the place of. God, you're doing something in my life. Well, it turns out that the guy who he's interning for, who he will eventually, in his heart, know he's going to take over, that guy gets jealous because all David does was do a really good job at what Saul asked him to do. I need to go to battle. I need you to kill some people. And David does this really well. In fact, he does this 10 times as good as Saul does. And Saul, his mentor, Saul, his boss, Saul, the guy who should be giving him a hand up into the palace, now has his eyes on him and says, you're next. You're next to die, and I'm going to hunt you down. And Saul basically turns David into Katniss, and we got a Hunger Games situation going on for the next years of his life. David goes on the run from the person who should have been the one who was mentoring him. So now he's overlooked by his dad. He's criticized by his brothers. He's chased by his mentor. And then later on the line, he's criticized by his own wife when he's bringing the presence of God into the place. And she's like, why can't you be more professional? David's relationships were not pretty. Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever felt cornered by the feeling that the people who should have had their arms around you are now stiff-arming you? And you're up to figure out the next season of your life alone, not knowing who to turn to, not knowing where you're supposed to be, not knowing who you can trust. This is where David was at in his moment of his life. What kept him going? What kept David going, we'll see in Psalms 139, is this. David had a revelation of God's character. David had a revelation of God's faithfulness to be constantly present with him. And it kept David going. When everybody else was stiff-arming him, he knew he could draw close to God. When everyone had their opinions about the way he conducted his life, he knew he had a safe place with God. We see David process this in Psalms 139. So as we look at this, if you're in this place today and you feel overlooked, if you're in this place today and you feel abandoned, if you're in this place and you feel wrongly accused or misunderstood, know that there is a place within Psalms 139 for God to reveal himself to you and allow you to know that you are known, you are loved, and you are seen. Psalms 139, there's 4 things that you can write down about this, and then we'll look at them. And you don't have to write them down right now, but David knew that God knows him. He knew that God surrounds him. He knew that God made him. And he knows that God tests him. Let's look at verse 1 through 4. Verse 1 through 4 of Psalms 139, as David is processing a difficult season of his life, not knowing who to trust, he says, God, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all of my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. In David's trials, he approached God to experience the feeling of being fully known. Fully known. Imagine the backdrop of these statements. The backdrop as David's begun to writing this. His father overlooked him. His brothers accused him. His wife misunderstands his intentions. Yet the presence of God was a place he could be honest without judgment. He knew that there was a place with God where he could be honest about the concerns of his life. He could be honest with God about the relationships of his life. And he knew that no matter what he poured out to God, there would be no judgment. There would be no hostility. There would be no condescension. He said, God, you search me and you know the things that I'm going to say before I even say them. You finish my sentences. He approached God as one being fully known by him. And because of David's faith in God's character, he allowed himself to be searched and vulnerable without fear. David knew that God was omniscient, meaning he's all-knowing. He knows everything all of the time. But we all know that knowledge in the wrong hands is a destructive thing. That's why we curate our social media. It's why we post only the good things. I have some people tell me sometimes that see me on Instagram. They're like, "You're such a fun dad." And it's like, because I only post the fun things. Like I don't post those moments where I'm just exhausted and I put my son on the couch and he's just sitting there watching Llama Llama and I have my phone on my knee with an earbud in my ear just zoned out like, God, you gotta get me through this day. Like that doesn't get likes. Like me like this with one earbud is not like good dad status. Like we curate the things that we want people to know. Unless we're preaching, then we tell everything, apparently. We do this because we know that information has power. When people ask us how we're doing, we give them vague responses because knowledge has power. And we're not sure what kind of information people can be trusted with. And so we leave breadcrumbs leading to our heart with the people that are around us, and we begin to test their responses, and we begin to look in their eyes to see if they're judging you as you say what's going on. And they begin to pause in moments, and we begin to pause in moments when we can see a look of confusion, or see a look of condemnation, or see a look of condescension in somebody's eyes, and we stop there. It's too much information. I'm going to stop here. We all do this with our social media, with our interactions with friends and strangers and family and spouses and kids. We curate the information that we're going to give people because we're not sure if we can trust that they'll handle it well. Because we all get to steward the information that we know about each other. We get to create safe spaces for each other. We get to create safe spaces to be friends. But what David knew, he didn't always know that his family was a safe space. He didn't always know that his work environment was a safe space. But you know what he did know? The presence of God was a safe space to pour out his heart, to be completely vulnerable in God's presence, and to know that he is loved and that the information is going to be stewarded well. Do you have that place? Not just with friends and not just with family and not maybe with a spouse, but do you have that place with God? Or are you still leaving breadcrumbs in the form of small, vague prayers to God, trying to see how are you going to handle this frustration? How are you going to handle this resentment? How are you going to handle this question, God? Do you have a safe space in the presence of God for you to be known? My prayer is that you do. But it only happens when you trust his character enough to know the true heart of God and the way he's going to steward your heart well. Not only did David know that God knew him, but he knew that God surrounded him. Let's read verse 5 through 12. He says, "You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I settle on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, the light will become night around me. Even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you." David, as he's penning this, is a man who knows what it's like to be hemmed in. Verse 5, he writes, "You hem me in behind and before." David knew what it was like to be hemmed in. He spent his life on the run. He knew what it was like to be trapped in a cave with a man chasing him. He knew the fear of somebody who was trapping him in a corner. He knew what it was like to be hemmed in. He had been cornered in caves. He had been run out of house and city. He had every natural right to keep his space bubble large and to avoid every feeling of being trapped. Yet in verse 6, he talks about how wonderful it is to be trapped by God. He goes on to say how great it is that he cannot escape God. This is a guy who is desperately trying to escape Saul and Saul's army for a large portion of his life, and yet he finds safety in the feeling of being trapped by God. And why can he say this? Because he knows the character of God. He knows the safety that's in God's presence. The safety of God's presence was the antidote for this man on the run. And that presence followed him wherever he went. Do you ever feel trapped? Now, I don't mean that in the way that like your boss is out to kill you. I certainly don't. That's good. That's why I'm here today. But you ever feel trapped? Culture has a way of making our world feel smaller and smaller and smaller as information seemingly makes it bigger and bigger and bigger. Do ads for things, like, do they ever make you feel a little bit trapped? Like, have you ever been trapped in the triangle of seeing an ad on a billboard or on scrolling through something, or you see the ad for something you want, and then you see your version of that thing that you currently own, and you're like, I want that upgrade, I want that. And then you look at your bank account, and you're like, well, I want that, and I have that, and I can afford this, and now my world seems smaller because I can't get all of the things that I want. Like for me, I'm not like a car guy, and I'm not a clothes guy. I have friends who could spend a lot of money on these types of things. Like for me, it's aesthetics. I don't know if you're supposed to admit this as a guy, but I could spend a lot of time on Pinterest looking at other people's living rooms. And then I look at my living room, and then I look at my bank account, and then I look at the chairs that I have in my living room, and I realize the reason we're keeping these is because they're glorified trampolines for my 3-year-old. And if I get that chair on Pinterest, it'll just turn into that chair in about 3 weeks. And so why spend that money? And then it's this triangle of just my world is not what I want it to be. You ever feel trapped by that? Or you ever feel trapped? Okay, this is for the maybe young parents in the room, but you ever feel trapped by parenting blogs? You ever have your world feel a lot smaller by reading the blogs that are supposed to help you? Like, you ever read an article that says like 72 sensory activities that will turn your kid into a genius in 3 weeks? And then you look at your kid and you realize the only sensory activity he has right now is to figure out the consistency of the booger that he just picked out of his nose. And like, he's riding the dog, and you're like, I love this kid, but I don't see all of the connections here. And so now comparison is making our worlds feel smaller and smaller because we don't know how they do it, and they're not really doing it anyway. That's what they're not telling you, but it looks good. What about, if we were to get a little closer to the nerve, what about looking at trying to build new relationships in our lives, but knowing that the past relationships haven't gone so well, and it causes us to be terrified? We're scared to make friends. We're scared to start that new relationship. We're afraid to step out because it hasn't gone so well all the time. My world feels trapped because of the failures in the past, or why does it seem like people get pregnant and engaged in series of 10 every single month, and you're trapped wondering, God, what do you have for me? I know what I'm called to, but nothing's going well. David knew what it was like to feel trapped. I have a feeling that a lot of us do as well. But David knew that he couldn't run to things that don't satisfy. David knew that the only thing in those moments when our world feels small, when our world feels trapped, the only place for safety is in the presence of God. Is in the God who hems us in, the God who goes before us and goes after us, the God who is constantly present. We are called to stillness, and we are called to being fully known. And for many of us, it will take experiencing how intimately known and loved we are by God for an extended series of time for us to be healed enough to begin that same pursuit in social situations. We have to experience His all-knowingness and His love, and it'll build an identity in us. It'll build confidence within us. It'll build security in us enough to take the risk to do the thing that we've been terrified to do because we felt trapped. God knows you. God surrounds you, and God also made you. Verse 13 says, You created my innermost being, and you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you When I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. When others around David were trying to insert their purpose, their security, their success on him, David found rest on God's intentionality for him specifically. God didn't see a mass of people, God saw David. God didn't just create humanity, he created David. He created you. He created me. And he knew that God saw him as he made him, not what society told him. Jesse, David's dad, only saw him as a shepherd. Eliab, his oldest brother, just saw him as conceited and self-serving. Saul only believed in David as long as David was making Saul look good. David's wife was embarrassed of him, yet he went to God's presence to remind his own soul that God imparted purpose and direction into his being before he was ever born. And he wrote these words of this song. He wrote things like, I will praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. You created me, you knit me. And just like David, you and I were knit by God. You and I were created by God. You and I were intentionally formed by a God who loves and cherishes you and I. He formed the form of your body. We were to sit on each one of these thoughts. It would probably convict us, it would confuse us, and it would hopefully inspire us. He formed the form of our body that we so desperately try to keep out of sight of people all the time. He formed it. He began to knit your personality. The very thing at the core of us that makes us us, our personality, our soul, our mind, our will, emotions. He had purpose when he created your personality, when he created exactly who you are. And yet we at times allow other people's opinions of those things dictate us. And in the presence of God, God reminds us who we are at our core, not what other people call us and not what other people dictate that we are supposed to be. Many authors of the Bible use the theme of God as a potter. All throughout the Bible, it's a major theme of God as a potter. Paul goes as far as saying God is not only a potter, but we are not to question the vessel he makes us into, no matter if it's noble or ignoble. Paul had this view of God, that God had purpose, however he created us. You were created with purpose. You were created with prophetic purpose. Like verse 16 says, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. The word days could be also translated as seasons. Like God knows the season you're in right now. And not only does God know the season that you're in right now, but he knows how it connects to your past, your present, and your future. And he knows how to wrap all the good parts. He knows how to wrap all the bad parts together and to push you forward into the prophetic purpose that's on your life. God has your back. God knows your seasons. God knows what you're going through. God made you the way that you are, and he wrote your life into a book that he will see to pass. But often, we miss the moments in the presence of God where he is allowed to confirm the season that we're in, to define the person we're to be in it, and to teach us how to walk forward in the midst of our seasons. We don't spend time in his presence. We don't have a meeting place where he can let us know that he knows us, he surrounds us, and he made us. And the pressures of culture and the pressure of relationship causes us to spiral into comparison and wandering far too often. And I hope that you know you have a God who thinks about you constantly. He is not bound to time. He doesn't sleep. He is awake thinking of you and I all the time. How wonderful to me are the thoughts that God thinks. They're more vast than the sands of the sea. God knows you. God surrounds you. He made you, but he tests us. Look at this weird turn that David takes in verse 19. If only you, God, would slay the wicked. Like, how many have ended the week with that prayer? This song is just getting weirder. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive ways in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. David, like us, had real primal responses to difficult relationships and situations he found himself in. And we see that as he wrote this song. Real responses. And you know where he went and took those real responses to? Took him to the presence of God. And you know what? He had the relationship with God and the trust in God's character enough to create a space for. He created a space to say, God, I'm going to vent. God, I'm going to pour my heart out to you. And while I'm pouring my heart out to you, I'm going to give space and I'm going to give room for you to test me. I'm going to give space and room to correct me. David knew that anger actually is part of the character of God. There is space in all of our hearts for righteous anger. In fact, if I were to take a side note for 1 second, many times God speaks to us about the calling of our life based on the things that make us most angry. The righteous injustice that happens on this planet that catches your attention time and time again. As we bring them to God, God can confirm I put that in your heart. But David knew anger was okay, but not every angry thought. No matter how many times we attach it to the purposes of God, no matter how many times we say it's part of our righteous anger, not every angry thought and angry vent is actually something that would please the heart of God. And David knew that, but he trusted God enough to correct him when he did it. He trusted God enough to vent, and he trusted God enough to correct. And he said, God, test my anxious thoughts. It basically saying, what about you do I need revealed that I can put my heart to rest? God, reveal yourself to me so that my anxious thoughts will be put to rest. He said, test my ways, or the outworking of my thought life. God, does my words, does my ways, do they offend you? God, lead me in the right way. And for him to lead us in the right way, he has to reveal something new about himself to us in the season that we are in. He leads us as he reveals himself to us. And as he reveals himself to us, our response, saying, God, I want that part of you to be part of me. I want the way you think about this situation to be the way I think about this situation. I want your compassion to be my compassion. I want your anger to be my anger. God, transform my life. Lead me in the way that's everlasting. But if we don't pause and allow him to reveal more about who he is to us, we will continue to just do the things we've always known to do. We won't move forward. Our intimacy with him will not progress. We will feel as if we're always on an awkward first date with God as we pray. We're always trying to figure out what's the next question. We're always going to lead little trails of breadcrumbs to our heart. Will you, God, what will you do with this little piece of information? What will you do with this resentment? What will you do with this question? God, my relationships aren't perfect, but you put me into the family that you put me into. Why, God? Psalms 27, God says, my father and my mother reject me, but God, you receive me. Something that David knew about God's relationship to him. That he could look at his relationship, as messed up as it was with his own parents, and say, I don't know. I know you receive me, and I'm going to let that settle my heart. I know you're for me, so I'm going to focus on that. For just a moment, we're going to practice stillness. It's a little bit lost in our society, and it's only going to be for a minute. I promise. We're going to practice being still in his presence and let him reveal himself to us a little more. If this type of practice makes you feel uncomfortable, I'm kind of glad. Because we only grow when we put ourselves in uncomfortable situations. We only grow in prayer if we can move past those awkward first date encounters with God and let him know a little bit more about us. So for just a moment, we're going to pause and be still. And if you don't know what to do in that moment, I'll give you two things you could do. You could take these statements right here and pick one of them that might associate with the season that you're in, that you really need him to speak to you about. You could just in your own heart begin to repeat it over and over. God, you know me. God, you know me. God, what do you know about me? What do you know about me that speaks to this season? God, I'll speak to you. Or take one of the scriptures from Psalms 139 that stood out. Again, slowly, in repetition, in your own heart, begin to meditate on it, to mull it over. We're going to do that for about a minute. And we're going to pray and we're going to be dismissed. Okay? Let's take a deep breath in. Holy Spirit, for the next minute, would you speak to us and reveal more of you to us? God, today, we don't give you our lists. We give you our hearts. We want to be closer to you. Our relationships don't always work out the way we want them to, God, but we know that with you, we find safety. With you, we find the safety of being fully known and loved. We find the safety of being surrounded and safe. We find safety in knowing that you intentionally created us with purpose. And we know we don't do everything right, but you're guiding us, you're testing us. God, teach us to find safety in that. For those of us maybe in this room that don't know you, I pray, God, that you would reveal yourself to them. That you sent your son to die on a cross for all of us so that we don't have to be the same, that we don't have to live life alone, that you journey with us and you saved us from ourselves and the corruption of our sin. Would you lead them to you today, God? In Jesus' name, amen.